we're going to go ahead and get started. Really want to, on behalf of our sponsors of this event, Environmental Advocates of New York, Delaware Riverkeeper Network, the Adirondack Mountain Club, Pace Law School, the Hub Law School. I went before the Hub was made, but Katie will do it correctly. And then, of course, Green Amendments for the Generations. And we're really just so grateful to all of you for coming to learn about constitutional environmental rights protection and a great opportunity here in the state of New York to advance this idea for present and future generations. The way we're going to start is I'm going to give you a little bit of, I'll introduce myself, and then I'll give you a little bit of a primer on constitutional environmental rights and this concept of a green amendment and why what New York is doing is so important. Then we're going to hear from Kate Carrera from Environmental Advocates of New York. She's going to give us the state of play here in the state of New York. And then we're going to hear from Carl and Katie and Christina, our panelists, who are activists and attorneys here, very active here in the state of New York. And they're going to give you a little bit of their thoughts about the importance of a constitutional environmental rights amendment here in the state of New York. And then we're going to jump into our Q&A. I'm going to encourage you to put your questions in either the chat or the Q&A feature, whichever is most comfortable to you. Just reminder, if there's a lot of chat discussion, it might be hard for me to find the questions. I'm going to moderate the Q&A. I might pop in here with an answer here or there, but mainly it's going to be our three panelists that you're going to be directing your questions to. And so with that, I am going to hop right in. So I am Maya Ben-Rasa. I have had the honor of serving as the Delaware Riverkeeper and leader of the four-state organization, the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, for the last 27 years. And as an outgrowth of that work, doing environmental advocacy and litigation to protect our beautiful Delaware River, I have now founded a new national movement and national organization called Green Amendments for the Generations, and written the book, The Green Amendment, Securing Our Right to a Healthy Environment, really focused on this topic. And it's really, I call it a glorified fact sheet. It's really my initial foray to try to inspire every state across our nation and ultimately at the federal level to add to the Bill of Rights section of their state constitutions and our federal constitution a constitutional right to clean water, clean air, and healthy environments. And that's what we're here to talk about, right? We're here to talk about the state of New York, where there is coming forth a proposal, coming forth to the people of New York. It's been through the legislature, Kate will talk about that, but coming before the people of the New York, the opportunity to add to the Bill of Rights section of the New York Constitution that each person shall have a right to clean air, water, and a healthful environment. Now, often when people hear about this idea of constitutional protection for environmental rights, particularly here in the state of New York, where the state is so progressive on environmental protection, people often ask the question, why do we need, this constitutional environmental rights amendment? After all, we have all kinds of laws and policies, programs, regulations, agencies, all of which are supposed to be focused on securing environmental protection and restoration. So how is it possible that we want something more? How is it possible that we even need something more here in the state of New York? Well, without going into my usual assessment of the laws, which provides value to answer that question, but truthfully, we don't need to do an assessment of the laws on the books here in the state of New York to see that something more is needed when it comes to environmental protection. All we have to do is look at the news headlines. And when we look at the news headlines, we can see that across the state of New York, there are people who are drinking contaminated water, breathing contaminated air, forced to live next to toxic sites. Environmental racism continues to be perpetuated, to advance, and even to grow here in the state of New York. We have species of all kinds that are being brought to the brink of extinction. And of course, we are facing the ravages of a climate crisis. So just looking at what is actually happening on the ground, we can see that something more is needed when it comes to environmental protection, that we actually need a new path that is going to reorient our state government here in New York to be focused on prevention of pollution and environmental degradation first, not simply jumping to the end of the decision-making process where really all we're focusing on is how are we going to manage the environmental pollution and degradation we decided is simply fine. What permits are we going to issue? No, we want to be focused on prevention first. We need a new path that's going to help us fill the gaps in the law. There are a lot of things legislatively, regulatorily that are simply not covered when it comes to environmental protection. PFAS, PFOA, right, PFCs is a perfect example. One of the reasons why communities across New York are drinking water contaminated with this man-made family of chemicals is because for too many years, including in significant part still modern day, the use of this man-made family of toxic chemicals was unregulated. There was a big gap in the law. That's just one example of many of where there are environmental issues, serious, significant environmental issues that are not addressed under our current law, and we need something to fill the gaps until the laws can catch up. Environmental racism, we need a system of law. We need a new pathway that is truly going to empower us to end environmental racism and the disproportionate targeting and burdening of communities of color, indigenous, immigrant, and low-income communities who are continually subjected to a disproportionate burden of pollution in the air, in the water, in their communities, and suffer all of the health, economic, and quality of life ramifications that brings. What we need is we need a new path that's going to raise up our rights to clean water, clean air, and healthy environments so they are protected as powerfully as we protect all of the other fundamental rights we hold dear here in the state of New York. Things like the right to free speech, freedom of religion, private property rights, the right to bear arms. And yes, here in the state of New York, one of the most fundamentally important rights that the people of New York hold dear and is protected in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution is the right to play bingo. Certainly, adding a right to clean air, water, and a healthful environment certainly deserves as much protection as the right to play bingo. And all of those other fundamental rights that are really important to us that we hold dear. But the fundamental basic right to access and benefit from a clean and healthy environment is certainly on par with all of those other fundamental rights. Now, if you want to give highest standing recognition and protection to the environment, to the environmental rights of the people, not just any language will do or any placement. There are actually, by my count, 44 states that talk about the environment in their constitutions, but they don't give environmental rights that highest protection and standing because they don't fulfill sort of the basic fundamentals of what I have defined to be a green amendment, right? They don't include all of the essentials necessary to get that highest protection. They aren't in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. So this is what you need. If you want to have that highest protection, you need to have language that's placed in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution where all of those other fundamental rights are placed. You need to be clear that you are protecting the rights of all the people. You need to be clear about what rights you're protecting, that you're protecting things like clean water, clean air, and a healthful environment. There are a lot of states that have provisions in the Bill of Rights section of their Constitution, but they are protecting the rights to fish, hunt, trap, and navigate, not the rights to the basic fundamentals of clean water and clean air. So the language needs to be clear about what it is that we're protecting. The language, the provision needs to be self-executing, meaning it has legal life and enforceability just standing on its own as soon as it's added to the Constitution. You have a right to clean water and clean air. That is an enforceable constitutional right. You don't have to wait for government to act in any particular way. And you need a provision that by its terms and placement will apply to all levels of government in the state, from the local town council through the state legislature up to the governor's office, and include all of the agencies in between. And there are actually two states at this point, Pennsylvania and Montana, that have and give this highest constitutional protection by having amendment language that fulfills all of those fundamentals, again, of what I've defined to be a green amendment. As a result of work and a major success I had in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, a number of years ago, I had this idea of getting this highest constitutional recognition and protection for environmental rights into every state constitution across the nation and ultimately at the federal level, and started this National Green Amendment movement. And so at this point, after just a few years, in addition to the two states, Pennsylvania and Montana, where we already have this highest protection for the right to a clean and healthy environment, we now have 13 other states poised to come on board, 13 other states where constitutional environmental rights amendment on par with what Pennsylvania and Montana have already been proposed and are advancing through the process, all at different stages, and more states coming on board all the time. But New York State is front of the pack. New York is the national leader at this point in advancing the first in the modern era opportunity to secure a constitutional Bill of Rights provision that will recognize and protect the rights of all the people to clean water, clean air, and a healthful environment. I just want to go really broad strokes about how will having this constitutional environmental rights amendment change things for the people of New York if it's passed. We're going to get into more detail with the panel, but I want to do some broad strokes so people have an understanding. First off, environmental rights do get that highest constitutional recognition and protection. Think about how powerfully the rights to free speech and private property rights are protected because they are recognized and protected in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. Well, now that same power and strength comes to bear for the environment. With a constitutional environmental rights amendment added to the Bill of Rights section of the New York Constitution, all government officials are going to have to reorient the decision-making process. So they are focused on prevention of pollution and degradation first, no matter what they're doing, legislating, regulating, permitting, decision-making. Government's now reoriented towards prevention by virtue of their constitutional obligation. Environmental justice is incredibly empowered because now every individual, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, their socioeconomics, we all have the same constitutional right to a clean and healthy environment, and all government officials become constitutionally duty bound to protect the rights of all the people equitably. It means no more environmental sacrifice zones can be allowed to advance with this constitutional environmental rights amendment in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. Government is now going to have to be able to demonstrably, they're going to have to be able to demonstrate that they engaged in truly informed decision-making all the way throughout the decision-making process, looking at the science, existing conditions, and cumulative impacts. That becomes a constitutional obligation that is enforceable, and we've demonstrated that in Pennsylvania and Montana. This is not going to result in lawsuits of neighbor against neighbor because the Bill of Rights section is focused on government action, right? So this is about protecting the environmental rights of the people from government infringement. We're not going to see lawsuits of neighbor against neighbor. And this is not about stopping all economic development in the state. That's simply not going to happen. Look at Pennsylvania, Montana, that's not the reality. But what this environmental rights amendment is going to do is it's going to ensure that we are advancing sustainable economic development, not exploitive or exploitative economic development. And the judges have gone to great pains in legal decisions to make this clear by saying things like that the environmental rights amendment does not call for the derailment of economic development. It simply ensures that economic development cannot take place at the expense of an unreasonable degradation of the environment. The goal of the Constitutional Green Amendment, the Environmental Rights Amendment, is better decisions by government from the get-go. Advance the good, prevent the bad. The reality of the amendment is that when people believe that the rights have been infringed upon, they will have the opportunity to go to the courts to vindicate their constitutional rights to clean air and water and a healthful environment. And what we can see in Pennsylvania and Montana is that green amendments, environmental rights amendments of this kind are really making a difference. They are helping to solve and address serious issues of environmental concern, not frivolous issues. They've been used to strengthen municipal authority to advance more protective decisions within their communities. They have helped to prevent the misappropriation of environmental protection funds, drawing them away from natural resources protection to simply be put in the general operating fund. They have helped address serious laws of constitutional concern. For example, a very pro-fracking law in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that would have put in place automatic waivers of environmental protection standards for the fracking industry and relieve the industry of the obligation to notify people on private drinking water wells if their drinking water had been contaminated. My organization, the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and I, in my role as the Delaware Riverkeeper, challenged this devastating law using Pennsylvania's Article 1, Section 27, and were victorious in getting the provisions of concern declared unconstitutional. So they were never allowed to inflict their devastating consequences on the people of Pennsylvania. And that was, in fact, the massive transformational victory that set me on this National Green Amendments for the Generations path. The constitutional environmental rights amendments have been used to address problematic permitting, where there were going to be serious environmental consequences, associated economic consequences, and where the permits simply did not properly address environmental protection. Right now, we are using Pennsylvania's Green Amendment to secure cleanup of a long ignored toxic site in a highly contaminated condition with a spreading pollution plume, where government has done nothing for decades despite having existing law and responsible parties that could address the problem. And the Green Amendment has been used in the state of Montana to protect government from having to enforce a private contract that actually could have resulted in the severe contamination of an entire town's drinking water supply. So just by that list of examples, I hope you can see that there are a lot of ways that this constitutional protection can be put into play for the benefit of the people of New York, including protecting the people and their rights to a clean and healthy environment, and also ensuring that government is better able to fulfill their obligation to protect the environmental rights and natural resources of the state for the benefit of all the people. So with that, I hope that I've taken you to a place where you join me in believing that all the people of New York should have a constitutional right to clean water and air and a healthful environment, and that you are primed and prepared to support this initiative in the state of New York. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate Carrera from Environmental Advocates of New York, who has been a key partner in advancing constitutional protection in the state of New York.
Thanks, Maya. Hi, everyone. I'm going to quickly share my screen. I just have a couple quick slides. So as Maya mentioned, my name is Kate Carrera. I'm the Deputy Director of the Environmental Advocates NY. We're a nonprofit environmental advocacy group based in Albany and have been extremely active in terms of the passage of the two of the bills in the state legislature, and now kind of spearheading the campaign that we hope to be running to secure the vote yes. Maya already touched on this, but really a lot of this originated in New York with these communities that were facing environmental justice and environmental degradation. So the residents and children of Hoosick Falls, New York, who discovered dangerously high levels of PFAS chemicals in their water supply, as well as the communities of the south end of Albany that have faced environmental racism for years, from bomb trains going through to siting of other types of urban power plants. So these were really the voices in New York that came together in 2017 to kind of spearhead this. And I did a little kind of timeline to show you how the New York environmental rights has progressed in New York. So as I mentioned, it was first introduced in the Assembly in 2017, but didn't gain much traction. In 2019, fast forward 2019, completely newly elected legislature, both houses passed the bill on April 30th, around Earth Day. Because it's an amendment, I should have said to the beginning, because this is an amendment to the state constitution, there's a process that's outlined in the state constitution of how to secure an amendment to the constitution, which requires one by a constitutional convention, which wasn't the option, and the other option was passing the legislature passing a bill with the amendment in two consecutively elected legislatures. So the New York legislature sits for two sessions. So 2019, they sat for 2 sessions, they passed the bill. Now 2021, this recent history, the second passage occurred by both houses. And what that means is because we've secured the passage of the bill, which Maya already put up there, is very, very simple, 15 words. It will go straight to a voter referendum. So this is a vote that gets to the people. The legislature basically voted to give the people the right to vote for this. There's no governor involvement. There's nothing. So it goes to the ballot for the general election in fall of 2021 and early voting as early as October. Just a little bit of background in terms of this was a bipartisan voting record, right? So if this gives you kind of can give you a flavor of how New York views this, right? So if you look at, in 2019, we had about 75% of the legislature voting yes for this. And I put up the numbers there with the yes and the no votes. And then, fast forward to 2021, we have it's increased. So 80% of the legislature voted yes. And, with even 30% of the Republican members voting to support this. So that kind of gives you an indication if our legislature is a representation of our state, what it might look like if we go out, out on a ballot measure. So getting to yes, and there's a couple really important points here. So we've done some recent polling that really suggests, which is not surprising given the numbers of the voting record, that about 80% of 2021 likely voters would actually vote yes for this ballot measure. So that's extraordinary. There's actually been, and there's been other polling released recently, and I think Maya, you even had a headline on it on your slides from the Siena poll that basically said 90% of New Yorkers strongly support clean air, water, addressing water pollution, and 90% care about air pollution. So this is very encouraging, but at the same time, we can't rest on our laurels that this is going to pass, because we have a couple of challenges with this election, which is not a general, I guess what they call an off-year election, right? We don't have a governor's race. New York City has a mayoral race, which helps the downstate vote get out, which I think will be to our advantage for sure. But it's not the most, probably there's a lot of drop off in this election. So, and there's a couple things. So not only do we have drop off of people just not interested in voting in this kind of not of an off year, we still need 2 million votes out of the 3.5 to 4 million people that will turn up for an off year. So you need people to get out to vote for this measure if they had no other reason to get out to vote. And then the next thing is you need them to turn over the ballot to answer the question, which I know sounds a little silly, but there's quite a big drop-off rate for ballot initiatives. And so part of this campaign is having to not only get people out to vote for the environment and vote for environmental rights, but actually to remind voters to turn over the ballot. And I know Maya just had a couple minutes. So the last one is just how to get involved. And as I mentioned, environmental advocates, we've actually registered a campaign with the Board of Elections in terms of, and the campaign is vote yes for clean air and clean water. And we would love organizations to join our table, which is going to be made up, Maya and all the sponsors that are here are part of that. And that will be made up of a very broad and diverse group of organizations that will go out, and we'll need all the types of support we can get for disseminating the message to vote yes for this ballot measure. So if you're an organization and you're interested in being part of this, this campaign, I think my colleague was going to post in the chat a link to kind of a sign-on form that we've created where where you can express your interest and your level of support and how you'd like to be part of that in the campaign. And if you're an individual, we also have a pledge. So even if you're not an organization, as an individual, you're super important into getting out, because every single vote counts, and everyone you tell, every dinner party, or maybe now we're going to dinner parties, hopefully, or every event you go to, you just talk to all of your neighbors about this, so people are aware to get out to vote. And I think the one thing I didn't mention, but I wanted to mention, and it may come up in a question, is that the ballot question will be available 90 days before the election. So about early August, we shall actually see what the question will be on the ballot. And that question is formulated by the New York Board of Elections along with the AG's office, as I'm aware. And we would expect it to be simple and concise, just like the legislation itself. So I think I'll stop at that. And happy to take any questions too at the end.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. That was terrific. And so now we are going to transition to our panelists. Because I know the panelists will do a much better job at introducing themselves, as well as sharing, having the opportunity to share their thoughts on what it would mean to have this constitutional environmental rights amendment added to the New York Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. I'm just going to let them do a combination of self-introduction and sharing of thoughts. And we are going to start with you, Carl.
To unmute myself. All right, I'll assume you can hear me. Welcome. Thank you all for being here. We certainly need all of you to support this effort. I'm Carl Howard. I've been a federal enforcement official for 35 years with the US EPA. I'm here, however, in my individual capacity and not representing the views of the US EPA. The views here expressed are entirely my own. I've been enforcing environmental laws all these years, and I'm proud to say that EPA and our state counterparts have made enormous improvements in terms of air and water pollution and cleanup of hazardous waste and handling of hazardous waste and toxic substances. But after all these years, what's become clear is that we've largely missed the forest for the trees. We have not begun to address climate change in terms of laws and regulations, specifically addressing this existential threat. The New York State Constitution, like the US Constitution, has a Bill of Rights, which is where our right to free speech and assembly reside, for example. The US Constitution guarantees us the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But of equal import, the fundamental rights to clean air and water and a healthful environment belong in the New York State Bill of Rights, because without clean air and water and a healthful environment, there can be no right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is my hope that the voters of the state understand this and will pass the Green Amendment so we can pursue what I believe to be our most fundamental, our most important right, which enables us to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, and that's a healthful environment. So the Green Amendment opens the door to this type of legal action in New York. So far, the constitutions of the other states mentioned by Maya protect environmental rights, and so far the provisions of those states have been ruled enforceable by their respective state courts. Thus, private citizens like you have been empowered to sue on your own behalf and as part of a class action suit. This is a sea change. Currently, your protections reside in people like me. And while I'm busy enforcing environmental laws against polluters, you have no choice but to trust that my suits brought on your behalf suffice. And if it were clear that federal and state laws offer sufficient protection of human health and the environment, then there would be no need for additional constitutional rights. But as we will explain over the next hour or so, existing rights are not sufficient. You should not have to rely on me or anyone else to sue on your behalf. I can't know your individual exposures. If you are harmed by unclean air or water or an unhealthful environment, you should have the right to protect yourself. You do not have such a right now. But with the Green Amendment, you likely would have standing to sue on your own behalf. Also, as noted, existing laws are woefully inadequate to protect against climate change. In fact, they were not intended for such protection. And given the divided state of our Congress, there's no hope for national legislation on climate change. The only possible remedy at this point is the Green Amendment. We would be foolish to not seize this opportunity during the general election on November 2nd. And lest you think this is pie in the sky, there is a recent decision by a Dutch court which ruled that the giant oil company Shell must reduce its CO2 emissions by 45% by the end of 2030 compared with 2019 emissions levels, which is in line with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the goal of the Paris Accord. This is a historic verdict and victory by Greenpeace, along with Friends of the Earth Netherlands, along with 17,379 individual co-plaintiffs. It is the first time that a major fossil fuel company has been held accountable for its contribution to climate change and ordered to reduce its carbon emissions throughout its whole supply chain. This is the first time that a court has ruled a company must specifically reduce climate-changing pollution, and Shell is one of the world's 10 biggest climate polluters. It represents a breakthrough in terms of a court's willingness to dictate to a major business what it must do globally to protect the climate. The company is expected to appeal the district court ruling, so stay tuned. I'll also briefly mention here a US climate change case brought by Earth Guardians on behalf of 21 miners in the matter of Juliana versus the United States, and defended by Jeff Clark, the same guy who conspired with Trump to overturn the 2020 election, asserting that although the government's affirmative actions that cause climate change and the government has violated the youngest generation's constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property, it has failed to protect these essential public trust resources. A US district court along the way, Judge Ann Aiken said, "I have no doubt that the right to a climate system capable of sustaining human life is fundamental to a free and ordered society. But a divided Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals later ruled that while they recognize the gravity of the evidence of the plaintiff's injuries from climate change and the government's role in causing the harm, and the government is violating the plaintiff's constitutional rights, still, 2 of the 3 judges also reluctantly concluded that the plaintiff's requested remedies should be addressed by the executive and legislative branches rather than the courts. They punted. A 3rd judge, Josephine Staton, affirmed the youth's constitutional climate rights in a powerful dissent. Perhaps in time, Judge Aiken's dissent may become the law of the land. That's an important part of the Green Amendment, but a right to a healthy environment is only a part. The Green Amendment also protects your right to clean air and water. We'll get into the details later as to what that exactly means, but suffice it to say, by way of introduction, that these factors can relate to climate change issues, and they can be more personal to you, if you like, in that if you feel you are being exposed to unhealthful levels of contaminants in the air or the water, you can sue to protect yourself and your right to clean air and water, provided, of course, you vote in favor of the Green Amendment. You currently enjoy some level of protection against contaminants, but as demonstrated by the past 4 years, the enthusiastic enforcement of these laws is subject to political whim. In my career, I've seen enforcement wax and wane depending on the administration. The Green Amendment offers you some protection from that as well. As mentioned, other states and countries have constitutional protections, and they have proven to be useful for their intended purpose. They have not led to excessive litigation, nor judicial impingement on legislative authority, as some have feared. Given this positive experience elsewhere, and given the mercurial nature of existing protections, and given the gaps in these protections, And given your dependence on state and federal authorities to act on your behalf, I maintain that the time is of the essence for us to amend the New York State Constitution and add to its Bill of Rights the Green Amendment. The Green Amendment will protect you, your fundamental right to and need for clean air, water, and a healthful environment. And it may be the only avenue any of us has to fight climate change, the single greatest threat currently facing each and every one of us. Thank you. I look forward to addressing your questions and any concerns you may have regarding the Green Amendment. And I urge you all to vote yes on November 2nd in favor of the Green Amendment. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Carl. And next, we're going to go to Katie.
Hi. So I'm Katrina Q. I teach environmental law at the Elizabeth Haub School of Law at Pace University. And I'm getting a little feedback. Is anyone else?
We're hearing it a little bit, but we can hear you pretty clearly.
Okay. Over the years, in the course of teaching environmental law, I've become aware of many of the dynamics that Carl talked about. I've also read a fair amount of scholarship about constitutional environmental rights, not just Maya's book, but scholarship authored by another Pace alum, Jimmy May at Widener, and his colleague, John Dernbach. But I didn't really focus on the possibility of adopting an environmental right in New York until I was asked to chair the New York State Bar Association Environmental and Energy Law Section Task Force on the environmental aspects of the New York State Constitution. That was a task force of the Environmental and Energy Law Section. We were asked to look at the New York State Constitution from an environmental perspective. And at that point in time, New York voters were going to vote on whether to hold a constitutional convention to reform the entirety, to consider reforming the entirety of the New York State Constitution. And in the course of that experience, there were a few things that came into focus for me and made me a big supporter of the adoption of environmental rights in New York. So the first was, I had the pleasure of serving on this task force with a number of veterans of New York environmental law who have spent their careers working to protect the Adirondacks and Catskill forest preserves. And their perspective was, that they were very focused on making sure that no matter what happened, we didn't touch a hair on the head of the existing protections for those lands in the New York State Constitution. So the New York State Constitution includes a provision that provides that the forest preserve shall be forever kept as wild forest lands. And these attorneys had spent 20 years or more successfully protecting some of our most beautiful Adirondack forested lands in New York, and we're adamant that whatever happened with the New York State Constitution, that we not change a single thing because it has been so effective at helping them to prevent efforts to degrade that wilderness area. So that was very persuasive to me. And in addition, in the course of serving on this task force, I did an enormous amount of reading of cases in Pennsylvania and Montana, states where environmental rights have had real value. Those cases were inspiring and educated me about the ways that environmental rights can provide real value. And in addition, as Carl mentioned, in reading about the experience enforcing environmental rights in Pennsylvania and Montana, it became clear that the experience with environmental rights when they're adopted in those states, it undercut the arguments that are typically raised by opponents of environmental rights. In those states, there hasn't been an extraordinary flood of litigation, and most environmental policy is still made by legislatures and agencies. In other words, the existence of an environmental right hasn't caused courts to become the chief environmental originators of environmental policies. So the successful implementation of environmental rights with real benefits in Pennsylvania and Montana was very persuasive to me as well. And in thinking about constitutional environmental rights, I think it's an interesting exercise to take a step back and to ask why our constitutions don't already protect a right to a healthful environment. And I would submit to you that the answer isn't because we don't hold those rights dear, or that we somehow think that governments possess an unlimited power to degrade the environment we depend upon. But instead, it has to do more with the fact that we just didn't recognize the extent to which human actions could imperil the preservation of ecological systems in which life can flourish and allow us to enjoy all of the other constitutionally protected rights we have. So to my mind, environmental rights are far from radical. In fact, what they do is just make explicit something that I think most citizens have long mistakenly perhaps believed that they already have, or perhaps take for granted. I'll pause here to give a thank you. I see that I have one current research assistant and one former research assistant in the audience, both of whom have helped prepare memoranda to help me think about some of the legal aspects of how an environmental right, if adopted in New York, would function. And I will preface this by saying that there's a bit of uncertainty with respect to precisely how would an environmental right be interpreted and applied by New York courts, but I'm going to look into a crystal ball and give you my best assessment based on New York State case law. So the first thing is, I think that this Environmental Rights Amendment would be held by New York courts to be self-executing. And what I mean by that is that it could be given effect without the adoption of legislation and could even be invoked to strike down legislation that courts held violated its provisions. I also think in terms of enforceability, that the environmental right could definitely be enforced against public entities and governments, but likely would be interpreted by courts not to be enforceable against private parties. And third, that again, this is uncertain, but reading the case law, it seems likely to me that the environmental right would not be held by courts to provide for damages or monetary remedy. In light of all of that, as I think about the core value of an environmental right, I'm going to harken back to something that Maya mentioned at the beginning. Although we tend to focus on the big blockbuster litigation where an environmental right is invoked to strike down an unconstitutional, a law is unconstitutional, I sense that the most important contribution that a constitutional environmental right can make is to infuse government decision-making and approaches broadly, from top to bottom, to make them more precautionary and thoughtful in their approach. And at the end of the day, it's that infusion of an environmental precautionary orientation into the decision-making of government from top to bottom that is perhaps the most enduring kind of value that an environmental right can make, including, of course, coming in and being a backstop when something really wrong happens. PFAS, the harms of PFAS get obscured through through the malfeasance of chemical companies for decades. So we don't, have such a long delay in understanding the harms, or the legislature gets captured by an industry special interests. I'll stop there, and I look forward to exploring some of those points more in response to some of the questions. And thank you, Maya and Kate, for having us here. I'm enormously excited about this ballot measure and encourage everyone to get involved.
Thank you so much, Katie. And now we're going to hear from Christine.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Maya, for inviting me today. And thank you, Kate and Colleen, for organizing this great panel. And also, I want to say thank you to my fellow panelists for those great and insightful comments. My name is Christine Appa, and I am an environmental justice attorney. And I've spent my career working on issues related to public interest, particularly environmental health on behalf of children. And in civil rights, I've had experience working in civil rights as well. I'm particularly hopeful that this Green Amendment will pass, and I'm happy to share my thoughts about it. And it is well understood that environmental justice is becoming more part of the political awareness and social action. From the beginning of the environmental justice movement as we know it, when residents of Warren County, North Carolina, literally laid down in the street to prevent the continued degradation of their community, to the growing awareness that coronavirus as proliferates in communities, particularly communities that are experiencing environmental health ills, that we can see that while environmental justice is becoming more a part of the national and local dialogue, the iterative process of fighting for environmental justice, unfortunately, has remained similar over the past 40 years. You have a community that is deeply affected. The community organizes themselves, but the community seeks rights and remedies that are not often articulated in any law. You know, from the beginning, you have this tension where communities organize around an issue, but they're trying to simultaneously craft a remedy while craft a right while seeking a remedy to a problem that we all know exists. So what do? You continue to fight anyway because you know that it's the right thing to do. But as practitioners, there's a limited amount of tools that we can use to actually effectuate a goal. And what the environmental justice movement hopes is that raising awareness, putting pressure on decision makers, using different tools, whether they be litigation or community organizing or the power of journalism, that we can lead people to be more influenced by equity principles when wielding the power of the state. So in a sense, the goal really is to move from awareness to action to actual change. But then you experience the disappointments that come along the way because it's difficult to raise the issues, environmental justice issues, when the environmental legal framework isn't exactly positioned around a rights conversation. It's more of a procedural conversation. So if we look at what rights are available or what government controls from the time that President Clinton signed Executive Order 12898, requiring environmental justice to be factored into government agency decisions, you would think with the increased amount of environmental justice leaning legislation that there would actually be change in people's environment would actually reflect this legislative process, but it hasn't. And we can see that in communities that are facing cumulative effects of environmental burdens. In New York, our Constitution, the closest we have would be Article 14, Section 4, so the closest thing that we have to protecting us. But if you read it, it's really focused on the environment, and it doesn't really capture the personal effect that toxic pollution has on communities. And it's not a lever that people can pull. But with the Green Amendment, which the right would actually be articulated on paper, and it would be self-executing, and it would be tangible, and it would lengthen the considerations. It would broaden the scope of what factors are taken into considering whether or not an environmental action would have the kind of impact that is that can be possibly avoided or that can be maybe ameliorated by considering that if we take this course, it will infringe on people's fundamental rights as granted to them by the state of New York. So that's why I'm in favor of a Green Amendment to the Constitution. It would actually be a tool that I think would be effective. As Kate mentioned, it's kind of funny. You try to think, how will this play out? We don't know. We don't know how it will play out exactly, but I have some thoughts about that I'm looking forward to sharing as the discussion goes on.
Thank you so much, Christine. Thank you, Carl, Katie, and Christine for those really poignant remarks. That was super helpful. We have a lot of dialogue that's going on in the chat and the Q&A, so I'm going to grab as many questions as I can. They may be grabbed out of order. Rest assured, if you put a question in the Q&A, I did grab it. I just deleted it to sort of clear things out, but I have it in a Word document. So I'm going to start with somebody asked a question, which is right on par with the first question that we were thinking of asking. I'm going to ask one, maybe two panelists to answer this. I think that will be enough. But the way the question was framed by the attendee is, what is a healthful environment? Quote. And that goes along with, what is clean water? What is clean air? So does somebody want to help address that question? All right, Carl. Carl's trying to speak, but he's on mute, so go for it.
Sure. Let's work through this. Let's start with each person. What's each person mean? I used the word standing before, but I didn't explain it. Standing is the necessary precondition to bringing a suit. And each person is being empowered. Well, each person where? This is a New York State Constitution that we're talking about. So it certainly includes everyone eligible to vote in New York State, all registered voters. Beyond that class, if you can show a nexus, a connection to New York State, that might confer standing. There needs to be some reason for the suit to be brought in New York State. In all likelihood, the harm you're alleging occurred in New York State, and the state has some means to address it. And we'll work, the last part of this is healthful environment. I'll get to it, but let's touch briefly, and I'm sure Katie wants to get onto some of this too. Each person has the right to clean air. Well, what's clean air? You may be surprised to learn that one of the things I do is give out permits to pollute. If you want to be an industrial actor, you have that right in this country, but the government is going to set permissible pollution levels, that which science has deemed accessible or acceptable to put into the air, or the water, or the soil. So the permit will have that language and limit in it, and the permit will be issued, and that will enable you to carry out your business. So clean air is air that has contaminants in it, but does not exceed levels that are deemed safe by federal and state entities. You have under a Green Amendment, you have the right to breathe air deemed clean. Even without the Green Amendment, if government regulators fail to do their jobs, you have the right to sue us and make us do our jobs, and the court can say, do your jobs. But that is your only remedy. But with the Green Amendment, you now have the right to clean air, and you can directly sue the entity that is causing the problem. As Katie said, it would probably be a state actor, and it probably would not be a private party. But the state is empowered to do quite a bit, so you could immediately bring suit. Of more interest to me in the air context is that greenhouse gases have been ruled by the courts to be a pollutant. And so therefore you might be able to get into the climate change realm where you say, well, there are no federal or state laws dealing with these pollutants as it relates to climate change. So the Green Amendment would be your vehicle to get to that issue. Same thing with right to clean water. What is clean water? Again, the federal and state regulatory authorities set contaminant levels. You can discharge pollutants into the waters of the United States, but they cannot exceed certain levels. And so you have a right to drink and to use water deemed clean. If you have evidence that the water you drink exceeds the levels, then you can sue. You have certain rights now, but you would have more direct rights under the Green Amendment. I could see a way to get toward climate change with this piece of the Green Amendment as well. We know that the oceans absorb a great deal of CO2 and is becoming acidic and warming and expanding and threatening coastal habitat, both human and natural. As far as I'm concerned, that's a denial of our right to clean water. This is not how clean water should look or behave. We need a test case on this, and the Green Amendment offers us this possibility. Okay, so finally, what is a healthful environment? At the broadest level, a healthful environment is that which we humans depend on. We need clean air and water, but we also need rain and clean soil and functioning ecosystems to filter water and hold back flooding from tidal surges. We need conditions supportive of agriculture in terms of temperature and precipitation. We need a stable climate. To me, that's the kicker. As I've said, I've been an enforcement attorney for 35 years. We've made the air and water much, much cleaner over the past 50 years, but we have not addressed climate change. It is excruciating for those of us focused intently on the dangers of climate change, as articulated by nearly every expert climatologist in the world, that no national or international legislation exists mandating reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Gains have been achieved, but they're incremental and unenforceable. And as the Shell case demonstrates, bold action is possible, but we need to get in the courthouse doors. And Juliana shows us that we need standing to sue. The Green Act Amendment through the Clean Air, Clean Water, and Healthful Environment routes offer us this opportunity, and it's available to us if we act on November 2nd.
Great. Katie, would you like to add a few words?
Just to build a couple of points on what Carl says, and I sense that sometimes this question is coming from a place of, oh my gosh, these are such broad terms. How on earth are our courts supposed to figure out what that means? And so just a couple of thoughts in that regard. The first is courts do this all the time. So if you look at the New York State Constitution, what is a sound basic education? New York courts have a process for analyzing that question, right? And for approaching it. It's not uncommon at all for there to be broad constitutional language that courts then interpret. And when you think about terms like clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment, there's a lot for courts to look to. Decisions in other jurisdictions, existing environmental laws and regulations, doctrines like the common law public trust doctrine. There's a rich body of sources for courts to draw from in interpreting that. And people tend to go two different directions with, oh, this is really broad language. And the other say, that means courts are going to run amok and courts are going to take over and they're going to have all these definitions for what a healthful environment is. Or they say, oh my gosh, courts are going to be too timid. They won't be willing to say it all. They don't have any guidance. So they're just going to step back and they're always going to defer to the legislature. But if you look at what has happened in states like Montana and Pennsylvania, what you see is that courts are have been quite willing and able to take broad language and understand that although a lot of the time legislators and expert agencies are going to do a pretty good job at defining in very specific ways what is clean water, clean air, and a healthful environment, but that sometimes things go wrong. So sometimes you might have a legislative process that gets captured by special agencies. And so I'm thinking here of a Montana decision where a court struck down the application of a statute that would have waived anti-degradation requirements with respect to water to allow the discharge of arsenic contaminated water in service of a gold mine operation as violating the Montana's environmental rights provision. And similarly in Pennsylvania, as Maya talked about, one of the biggest successes in Pennsylvania has been the use of the Environmental Rights Amendment to push back against provisions of an act that was adopted to advance the fracking industry over the interests of local communities and local governments. So that's all I'll add into Carl's very thorough explanation of those terms.
Great, thank you so much. And Colleen's just putting in the chat a link to some resources. I've done some write-ups on key Pennsylvania and Montana cases that have gone forth, some of which you've heard about, that can give you a little bit more detail on how it's actually working in those states. So just look for the chat, look for the links. So Christine, I'd like to ask you kind of a combination of questions that have come in, but they're all related. And I think it would be helpful maybe if you can speak to them together. So first piece is, how is it that our current laws allow for or perpetuate environmental racism? And then related to that, and so sort of as a result, when we're thinking about environmental racism, when we're thinking about environmental justice issues, what are the kinds of harms, threats, problems that environmental justice communities are actually having to contend with? And how do you think a green amendment could help solve this, this combination of problems that's resulting in so much harm to so many people with such devastating consequences?
Oh, thank you for those two very insightful questions. I think that to start with, in terms of how environmental injustices are perpetuated, you have to look at the process for the process. It's process oriented. environmental law involves a lot of science and a lot of detailed analysis, but the process is really oriented towards making sure that certain boxes are checked. And if in that procedural analysis you don't include issues related to human health or the cumulative impacts that communities face because of environmental ills that surround them, then you'll have this dichotomy of a procedurally sound process and unfortunate outcomes. Then you'll have communities known as sacrifice zones because certain things have to happen. I can give an example. Just bear with me, I'm just going to adjust myself. So I can give an example of a case from 2005, and it's instructive for the reasons why we need a green amendment. So as we know, New York City has wonderful water quality, but it needs to be purified for water coming from Croton, one of the watersheds in New York. And they needed to build a particularly extensive water treatment plant. They needed to put it somewhere. Now, this is water that is supplying about 30% of New York City's water, which is critical, it's important. And it's a public work that needs to be completed. So the decision-making started almost 2 decades ago. And what the result was, they found land in the Bronx, Little golf course in the Bronx. They found that this was the best place to situate this water treatment plant. So a community group sued the Bronx Environmental Health and Justice Incorporated versus the City of New York. So the city argued that they had followed the State Environmental Quality Review Act, and that the processes that were required for them to go through, the boxes that were supposed to be checked, and the public engagement that was supposed to happen, happened. But the residents argued, the people from the community argued a number of causes of action, but I think 2 of them that are particularly instructive. They tried to invoke a constitutional right. They actually cited the New York State Constitution and said that they were entitled to some protection under the Constitution. In fact, they said that they were facing discrimination and that there was a violation of their equal protection. What the court found was that there are actually petitioners, and I can read from the decision, petitioners' allegations that the civil rights referenced in this section include a basic right to health and environment, and that the plain language of Section 11 protects against disparate impact discrimination, including environmental and health impacts, fails to support a claim for discrimination. Had there been a green amendment in place, perhaps the outcome would have been different. Would there still be a water treatment plant in New York? I don't have any doubt of it. But would the iterative process have been different? And would these residents who were able to come together and bring this lawsuit under the channels that were available to them and the tools that were before them at the time back in 2005, what would the dialogue have been? When the State Environmental Quality Review Act process is being conducted prior to the request for a permit, and you don't have to factor in environmental justice in the same way. But had there been a green amendment, there may have been a different outcome. So what we're looking at is how can we influence this heavily procedural, and what we really need, what's important, how do we influence this to ensure that the conversation also includes considerations of the outcome as opposed to ensuring that the process has been carried out correctly. And there's nothing more disappointing as an attorney to have to turn to a group of people who have committed to, dedicated themselves to organize around a principle that they are entitled to clean air, that they should be able to enjoy their communities in a way that everyone else does, and that their income, their race, their ethnic background shouldn't have any influence on how they live, or that where they live has any influence on how they live, only to find out that you actually are not protected in this way. And so that's that's a concern, and that's why I believe that the Green Amendment will really broaden this discussion in a way that infuses considerations of the outcome and the cumulative impacts that some communities face. So I think.
Thank you, Christine. That's great. And Kate, you must have been channeling me. I was just going to say, are you still on? Because there's a question here, two questions that I think are appropriate for you to answer, if you don't mind putting you on the spot.
Oh no, I have my 5-year-old running around, so I was just
Great.
Nothing was on fire.
Great. So this combination of questions is, one, is there any way that we, being the people of New York, can influence the language that the State Board of Elections uses to explain what the amendment means? And sort of a good complement to that is there any possibility that this proposal might not actually end up being on the ballot in November?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, the actual procedure for it going to the ballot is spelled out in the Constitution, and I can send the link to the actual language, but I'll read it right here. It's like, it is the duty of the legislature to submit each proposed amendment or amendments to the people for approval in such a manner, in such a time that the legislature shall prescribe. So they haven't prescribed any. The prescription is it's going to the ballot. So I think the answer to the question is yes, it's definitely going to the ballot in November, and there's no way that would necessarily change. In terms of lobbying, I guess the Board of Elections, and I do believe the Attorney General plays a role in crafting that question. I don't know that there's a formal way to do that. I'm sure there are ways for advocates to, as we are today, expressing our interest in how simple the language is, and would only expect that the language would be simple in terms of asking voters what they, of adding that right to the Constitution.
Great, thank you so much. Next question is for you, Katrina. If the Green Amendment passes, could I sue a company that contaminated groundwater in my neighborhood for violating my right to clean water? And could I get money damages?
So as I presaged before, this is somewhat uncertain terrain. And so what I'm about to offer is my best prediction about how the Green Amendment, or the Environmental Rights Amendment, if adopted, would be interpreted and applied by courts. And so I think that my short answer is probably not. So first of all, I think it's unlikely that it would be interpreted to apply directly to private parties. And second, it's similarly unlikely that it would be interpreted to provide for money damages. That doesn't, however, mean at all that the Environmental Rights Amendment wouldn't have value with respect to protecting access to clean drinking water. And a perfect example may be our experience with emerging contaminants like PFAS in Hoosick Falls. And something that I go back to a lot, it's a quote actually from the Business Council's Director of Government Affairs, who commented at one point that an environmental rights amendment is unneeded, because in his view, residents struggling with contamination of drinking water supplies like those in Hoosick Falls, quote, already have multiple means of legal recourse. And I struggle to understand what legal recourse a resident of Hoosick Falls had that would be remotely adequate. And so if you look at what happened in Hoosick Falls, at the time those residents of their own volition tested their water, found the presence of this chemical, and were able to Google and discover the studies suggesting the significant concerns about exposure to it, the presence of that chemical in their drinking water was entirely legal, to the point where they were precluded from applying for funding from the state to get them an alternate, clean, uncontaminated source of water because that chemical wasn't yet regulated. And if you dig under that, a big part of the reason the chemical wasn't yet regulated, it was being studied, had been under study for decades. But part of the reason we didn't have the level of scientific understanding that the regulators needed to move forward with regulating it is because the companies that manufactured the chemical had suppressed that information about its potential health impacts for decades. And so you had a situation where the regulatory process was paralyzed. So what is the recourse for the residents of Hoosick Falls? The presence of that chemical was entirely legal under existing law in their drinking water. And so the response might then be, well, they can go ahead and they can sue. They can bring a common law, personal injury, toxic tort suit, and sue for damages. And it is true that there is that cause of action. But I will point out that most of the time in our modern world, we're exposed to kind of a soup of chemicals and pollutants every day that come from many sources. We're exposed to them over long periods of time and in small amounts, and they interact in ways we don't fully understand. So in many, many cases, if you develop an environmentally caused cancer, you will not be able to identify the entity that exposed it to you, let alone go after them for damages, assuming they're even still a going concern, because the latency period here, they may well be bankrupt, right? But the more important thing is, if you were a resident of Hoosick Falls and someone came and told you, okay, yeah, it turns out for 10 years, you've been drinking a really high level of PFAS in your drinking water. And yeah, it's possible you're going to go on and you might develop one of these health impacts, including cancer. But don't worry, if you get cancer, we'll pay for your medical treatment. So you have legal recourse. I suspect that all of us would prefer that the state had taken a precautionary approach. And I can't tell you, if we turned back the clock and if there had been an environmental rights amendment in New York, would that extended time frame of exposure to such high levels of PFAS have happened? I can't tell you for sure. It's a counterfactual inquiry, but I suspect that once an environmental right is adopted, understood, and robustly enforced, that you have a heck of a better chance of citizens coming together, finding those studies, working to push back, and addressing those kinds of issues up front before there's that kind of level of exposure.
Great, that was super helpful. Thank you. And so a nice question that builds on that answer. And I'm going to let the panelists self-select by raising your hand which one or two of you would like to chime in here. Although a green amendment may not be enforceable against a private party, won't it still indirectly affect private parties, i.e. businesses, through things like permits, business operations, land development, requirements that the government enforces? Carl's going to take that. You're on mute, Carl.
I concur with everything Katie just said, but I also want to add the government's perspective on that. If there had been a green amendment, these citizens would not have been stymied for 2 years, given the fact that there were no contaminant levels established for PFAS. That was the problem for these citizens. That was a problem for acting. It was like, well, all right, is this a dangerous level? How do we know? Eventually, they uncovered these studies and determined that, yeah, these levels were high and of concern, but the state and the feds hadn't set any levels. And so everybody was pointing at everyone else and nothing got done for 2 years. Had there been a green amendment, who knows what could have happened, but one thing is certain, these people could have sued right away. They could have sued everyone involved, if they were private parties or not. They let the courts work that out. If the courts threw those cases out against the private parties, they would still be able to go against the government entities and say, government agents, do your job. Address this and do it now, and it would be done pursuant to a court time frame and not just the usual schedule of the way government proceeds, which sometimes can be a little slow. Who knows what would have happened, but certainly these citizens would have been able to take direct action immediately. And the courts would have overseen it and driven the process. All right, so if we have a green amendment and we're all putting on our capes here and looking into the future, our crystal balls, but one question is whether or not anybody getting a permit from the feds or the state is considered under law a state actor. There are many instances where entities receiving federal funds are subject to requirements that entities that are not receiving federal funds are not required to adhere to. So it is possible that the reach of the Green Amendment might be quite long. But also, as Katie said, the Green Amendment's impact on government may be top to bottom, and it may impact thinking, it may impact regulatory actions taken or not taken. Government planning to take action could be subject to suit by citizens under the Green Amendment if they can make a straight-face argument that the action that the government is about to take would violate their fundamental rights. And that could extend to the issuance of permits or rules or regulations affecting private parties. So the Green Amendment is potentially far-reaching. We have not seen cases quite like that yet, but a lot of this is new, even in Pennsylvania. So those are some thoughts.
Great. So Christine, is Christine still there? Oh, Christine might have had a child issue. She'll be right back. We'll save the question for when she comes back. Oh, there she is. Great. So Christine, thinking about issues of environmental justice. Carl just spoke a bit about, and Kate as well, about how in the near term, long term, the Constitutional Environmental Rights Amendment here in the state of New York could make a difference. From an environmental justice perspective, how would you see the Constitutional Environmental Rights Amendment, the Green Amendment, being implemented? And how might its impacts be visible in terms of environmental justice work and issues in the next 1, 5, 10 years? You're on mute.
Well, I think that how could it be implemented? I think it would fit very well into the gray areas that we experience in environmental justice. And I can give you an example. In the sense of environmental health for children, I've done some work on protecting communities and informing them of their rights when it comes to issues of school citing. Everyone wants their child to have a great education, but you also find that in environmental justice communities, the schools tend to be cited close to or dangerously close to environmental ills. If the city follows the proper procedure in terms of looking out and citing a school, there isn't really much recourse that parents and community members have. So I can give an example from a couple of years ago, which only recently I think is not as urgent, because I don't think, but just to start, in North Brooklyn, in the area of North Brooklyn, there was an old plastics factory, and the old plastics factory is currently designated as a Superfund site. Underneath this plastics factory, there's a plume, which is like a toxic soup of trichloroethylene, which is Maya mentions in her books, a very dangerous chemical, and phthalates, which if you are currently in the market for anything, you'll see no phthalates, no phthalates. So this is because this is a chemical that also has some serious effects on human health. Now, because this is a Superfund site, they're in the process of remediation. But at the very same time, there was also a school slated to be constructed in close proximity to this underground plume. So what does a community do when the School Construction Authority, along with the city officials, are working with the state government to remediate, but at the same time, you don't want your kids to go to school here. What levers do you have to pull? If there was a green amendment at the time, and you're looking to say, bring a lawsuit, but there hasn't been construction yet, but you know that there might be. So this tension that is parcel of the standing issues that Carl was mentioning, whether or not the issue is ripe, whether or not, you know, you have actually been affected in a particular way. These become very granular issues that communities, EJ communities face when an action may be potential or might happen. But if they were to pull on the third prong of the Green Amendment and say, I have a right to a healthful environment, well, that means that you would be able to articulate whether or not you think that the cleanup is happening fast enough. I think there's even been evidence that if a community is an environmental justice community, the measures or the depth of the cleanup might not actually mirror in a community that is more resourced or wealthier or may have a different census demographic. So I think the Green Amendment would help in areas where there's a kind of a bit of a tension as to how the community has been uniquely affected, which is required under standing requirements when you're trying to bring a suit, say, against the city. And it would help people to explain actions that may have already happened that you don't really think you have any recourse to. So if you do find that your school's already built and it's next to a highway and the children are getting sick, then what do you do then? There's not any direct action that is happening that you could put a stop to, but you're in a situation where you're experiencing an environment that is less than healthful. So I think in that sense, you could incorporate Green Amendment into your advocacy and actually yield some very interesting results. I think also it would bolster environmental justice as a planning tool. When people are having these discussions around the table, even if no one has yet sued under the Green Amendment, it will have to be part of the conversation because it's a potential liability. It's a potential that somebody could actually bring a suit under this. So in your conversations, even though you might not have to factor in all the principles of environmental justice, which is actually changing in New York City's law because of local laws 60 and 64, which advocates in the environmental justice community fought very hard for. Cities are currently undergoing a process to study environmental justice and incorporate it into decision-making process. But in the meantime, the conversations that developers will have when they're seeking permits, the conversations that people in the business community will have, they may be a bit different. And it's not just the business community, but also in the halls of government. So I think that this is an asset that even if it's not currently exercised, people use it as something to be very cautious of. It's almost as though it's a seat at the table that that may not be filled with the usual people that you might expect to be filled, but you know it's a consideration that has to enter the conversation. And there wasn't a place for that before. So I think in this sense, the Green Amendment could be very powerful.
Thank you so much, Christine. So we're going to take 3 more questions and we're going to try to get the answers in quickly. I'm actually going to address the next one. I get asked it a lot in my travels around the nation on this topic. It says, the question is, do you see the Green Amendment, the Environmental Rights Amendment, as paving the way for rights of nature legislation, or is the amendment situated to limit environmental rights based on human consumption of natural resources? And so, yes, the Constitutional Environmental Rights Amendment, the Green Amendment approach really is based on the relation on people and people's relationship with nature and people's relationship with their government. And you know, that really is what the Constitution is. It's about the agreement between the people and their government, and it's the people making very clear to government, we are allowing you to govern over us. But when you govern over us, there are these certain fundamental rights in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution that we are saying you may not infringe upon. And we are now adding the people's rights to a clean and healthy environment to that bucket of you may not infringe. There's a lot of question about the relationship with the rights of nature in other states, and we've been exploring that in some of the other states, but in New York, it really is that anthropocentric focus. and that is how a constitution works. And I think that that is very appropriate, but it doesn't mean that in other contexts, there may be value in terms of rights of nature thinking. I do actually have an information sheet on that on the forthegenerations.org website, so you can take a look at that to learn more. The other question, and I think I'm going to throw this to you, Kate, to do answer quickly, which is what can we all do now to help get the Environmental Rights Amendment passed?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I posted just in the chat recently, it's only a few up, a couple things you can do. So as individuals, you can take a pledge, we can collect that information. I mean, certainly talking to your local governments, talking to your neighbors, your friends, you know, there's lots of things we can do individually to get involved. And so joining the like signing the pledge or doing something through Maya's website, we know who you are, who are interested, and we'll be reaching out because at some point we're going to need hands on the ground and, you know, all hands on deck in terms of getting the word out. If you're an organization and have interests in other networks, grassroots, community, you know, environmental, all sorts, we have, you know, we're going to be really pulling together a diverse campaign with labor interests and teachers and scientists and doctors, all sorts of people to be the voices and validators and messengers for this. So we would love to hear from you if you are interested in getting involved. And what our campaign will look like as we move into the summer are events across the state with different local and state elected officials, perhaps. There's been so many champs in the legislature who've been very outspoken about this, this measure. So working through them and their constituencies and different grassroots organizations. And then certainly, of course, working with organizations that do door knocking, that actually their mission is to get out and turn people out to vote. So we'll be kind of incorporating all of those aspects into the campaign. So the second link is a coalition form where you can kind of indicate what level of support and interest you might be willing to get involved in.
And really quickly, one final question, because I think it's more a matter of interest. I know we're over time, but maybe people can be real quick with their answers. But given the level of corporate capture that we see within a legislature, including in the state of New York, given the state of play politically in terms of environmental battles, why do you think that there was so much support within the New York legislature to advance this constitutional environmental rights amendment and allow it to actually go before the people to decide whether or not they want to have it? Why don't we go down the line and have each of you give a few words on that? Carl, few words.
Yeah, I love that question because it can be very frustrating in government that so much of climate change and environmental issues in general has been made into a political issue, and it really shouldn't be. It should be science, and it should be what's best for all of us and the planet. And I'm heartened that the younger people that I talk to, whether they're Democratic or Republican, are beginning to see very clearly that climate change is a serious issue and a real threat. And so hopefully some of that shifting in political affiliation is being reflected in the New York State Congress. And maybe that's why some of the Republican representatives are seeing that it is in their interests, both personally and professionally, to have a Republican plan going forward and not just oppose everything the Democrats are doing.
Great. Katrina?
I have absolutely no idea about the inside political baseball about who voted for it and why. But I have found that one of the challenges of encouraging people to support the Environmental Rights Amendment is that most people already think they have a right to a healthy environment. So you have to start out by educating people about all the ways in which actually you don't have a right to a healthy environment right now. And what that suggests to me is that we're at a point where putting this, asserting and articulating this right clearly in the Constitution, it's basically enshrining something people already think they have. It's so embedded in our understanding and our expectations as citizens of the state of New York that in some ways it's just bringing the Constitution up to speed with what people actually already think is there, which makes it not only not radical, but almost overdue in a way.
And Christine.
Well, I would turn the answer and say that is actually the electorate. I think that people are becoming more informed. I mean, you can even witness, this is a Wednesday evening and we have like a digital packed crowd. You know, people have spent time away from their day to inquire about and find out about this Green Amendment. People are demanding more of their legislators. They're becoming more informed of the connection between the environment, their health, and their safety. And it becomes incumbent upon the elected officials to do something about it. And people are becoming more vocal. And the concepts, the principles of intergenerational equity, what we do today is going to affect not just this generation, the generation forward. It's starting to sink in when people can see plastics washing up on the shore, or seeing species disappear, or just people seeing their neighbors going to the emergency room because of asthma. People are getting tired of this. And if there is some sort of way that we could work together as a community, as an electorate, as a state, to advance the principle that we all are here together, and what we do in one community is eventually going to waft across the river and get to some other community that right now you're safe and protected, but tomorrow you might also be facing the same effects of pollution. Pollution is circular. It goes where it wants. It doesn't respect political boundaries, doesn't respect neighborhoods. It can affect everybody. So if we think together in this type of way, we're more motivated to pass legislation that is reflective of our goal, which is environmental justice or just a healthy environment. And then those are the reasons that I support it. But I think those are the reasons that the legislature is also moving in that direction.
And Maya, can I just add also, it's a very bad politically to have your vote being you voted against for clean air and clean water. So like, you know, there's that.
Yeah, but
I agree.
No surprise, that is true, but we still see those who come forth and they make ridiculous arguments against it. But that's the truth, right? They are ridiculous arguments. We have a good answer for every one of them. So if you're talking with somebody in your community about supporting this idea and they have questions or concerns or arguments, and you want to learn more about how to be responsive, you can go to nmgreenamendment.org. You can go to the websites of all of the sponsors of this event, and you'll find really good information to help you take on those challenging questions and be able to give reasonable, rational, and powerful responses to really help bring people along and encourage them to support advancing their constitutional right to clean air and water and a healthful environment. And just before I close out, I want you all to know that July 13th is National Green Amendment Day. I have claimed the day. And so also if you go to forthegenerations.org or nygreenamendment.org, you can learn more about Green Amendment Day and all of the fun activities and how you can get involved and learn more in another evening panel that's going to look more in depth into aspects of the power and importance of Constitutional Bill of Rights protection. And with that, I want to thank my panelists for this incredible evening. And I want to thank the attendees for the engaging conversation and chat and questions. And I hope you found it valuable and helpful and that you'll join us for the next one. Good night, everybody.